Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Sunny Correo and I'm with the New York City Parks Department, specifically with the Wildlife Unit. And I'm here just to share about our unit and how we can better coexist with urban wildlife in our outdoor spaces. So a quick reminder, let me just introduce what New York City Parks is because we are a big agency. We manage over 30,000 acres of land. That's about 14% of the city, and that includes playgrounds, beaches, swimming pools, ball fields, natural areas, green streets, and some community gardens. And both wildlife and people can be found in all of these areas. And as I mentioned, I work specifically with the Wildlife Unit, and our overarching mission is to promote coexistence between people and wildlife. So my unit, we serve as the ambassadors for New York City's diverse wildlife communities. That includes this handsome red fox right here. We want New Yorkers to be proud of the amazing natural diversity found here and not question why they might be seeing an eastern coyote or a wild turkey or even a fox in their neighborhood. So our goal is to promote coexistence between people and urban wildlife, and we do that through this list of kind of projects here: active research, education, resources for policy developers, and the list goes on. But we are a resource for you, for your community, for your garden members. And so today I want us to kind of consider how we use our outdoor spaces, how we spend time in them, whether it is a community garden or if you have a backyard, your local park, or your neighborhood in general. And let's kind of think about it and look at it through the eyes of wildlife. So I'm going to share some information about, very basic behavior and biology to kind of about some of our common species to get in their headspace and talk about some simple changes that we can make to coexist. It does mean we need to make the effort and think out of the box at times. And then I'm going to end this presentation just sharing some digital resources that you guys can further look through and share through your own networks and communities. As you are probably aware, New Yorkers of all kinds come in all shapes and sizes. So some of these species may look more familiar to you than others, but all of these can be found in New York City throughout different times of the year. And our outdoor spaces are an important resource, as I mentioned, for humans and wildlife. These spaces provide us with environmental benefits like air and water filtration or even temperature control, and they can improve our physical and mental health. For wildlife, outdoor spaces provide them with food, water, space, and shelter. And we all have a part to play when it comes to this coexisting message I'm promoting. Now, all of us are going to feel differently about these species. Some you probably really, really love and get excited to see. Others you might be bored with, and still others might stir fear or frustration. And we're all having different feelings towards these because each of us individually have had different experiences, different personal histories, and different comfort levels with these animals, and that's perfectly fine. So just take a moment, a little self-reflection, and which of these species here do you enjoy seeing or would you like to see? And maybe ask yourself why. Why would you look forward to seeing one of these animals? Now just kind of take a moment, and which of these species do you have an opposite feeling towards? Is there any fear or anger or frustration? And kind of reflect, why do you think you might have that feeling towards these different animals? And all of us are going to have different answers. So let's move on to our outdoor spaces. How do you enjoy or use these areas? Are you a gardener? Do you passively or actively recreate? Or are there areas that you use at times but just need access to? All right, now how do wildlife see these spaces? Some of these areas are food, some provide water, and others provide space or shelter to reproduce. And it's these overlaps between uses that we need to examine. So think back to that species that you kind of have like a negative or maybe a frustrating feeling towards. Think about where you're seeing it and where are you sharing the same space, and where do you get frustrated about sharing these same spaces? All right, so we have to examine this overlap to see what we can do to change our behavior or to change their behavior. So I'm going to the next few slides, I'm going to share some of these examples and tips, because basically what it is we're providing an attractant, something to bring the wildlife into these spaces. And if you don't want to have them in these spaces, we need to remove what's attracting them or to try and limit their access to it. So obviously, let's start first with the big one. Food resources are a big attractant for wildlife. It's a simple motivator for many animals, including this animal, as I point to myself. And just like humans, we have our favorite foods, favorite restaurants, favorite places to shop for food. Wildlife discover the best places to find food in the city, and they know when they are available and even what time of day they can become available. So I'm going to break this further down and kind of classify animals. These are my classifications. There's no scientific basis for these classifications, but I'm going to start with a group of animals that I'm calling health nuts. What I mean by that is these are animals that really use the natural resources for food, and they have a diet that follows the seasonal changes through the environment throughout the year. So this includes birds, squirrels, especially deer. What's neat about white-tailed deer is their diet, they digest different food, and their stomach processes changes to accommodate that. So during the growing season, when you have all these softer materials, flowers, leaves, grasses, that's what they're focused on digesting. And in the winter, when it's not the growing season, they're actually able to digest twigs and bark, very woody material. And their diets they've evolved to survive in the landscape like that. If you live in an area with white-tailed deer, you understand that they forage everywhere. They forage in our parks, they forage in our homes, they forage in the grass medians along streets. Now, you may want to discourage them from coming over to specifically forage in your areas. So one thing that we suggest is try planting native plants. New York City Parks Natural Resource Group, they've actually created a list of native plants that seem to be least preferred by deer based on some observations that they've made over the years. And I'll post a link to that in the chat. It's a PDF document. But here are just a few examples of some flowers, native wildflowers, which I think are beautiful. And they all have different seasonality. So native plants, the great thing about native plants is they've evolved in our area alongside these deer, and many have garnered traits that deter deer naturally. They may have chemicals in the leaves that create a better taste, or they have an uncomfortable texture that protects them from plant eaters. So let me give an example. You may know the connection between milkweed and the monarch butterfly. So milkweed is the plant in the top left of your screen, and you see the lower flowers covered with bees. So milkweed's leaves have developed this bitter chemical. It's the milky white substance if you break open a leaf. It's very bitter, and most animals don't like eating it. However, the monarch caterpillar has decided to capitalize on this over many, many generations of evolving. So monarch butterflies specifically lay their eggs on this plant, and it seems that when the caterpillars ingest the bitter leaves, the caterpillars themselves become untasty to birds, and it protects them from getting eaten in the future. So this is just something that they have capitalized on, but protects the plants from other animals that might eat it. So now I say this saying that this is useful to do. However, if an animal is hungry, if a deer is hungry, they are going to eat what they find. But the idea is that they may decide to eat your neighbor's more tastier tulips before they come over and attack your milkweed. And it's kind of also interesting, you can use these, the way you set up your gardens or your yards or even our parks, you can plant these in a way that might protect more sensitive plantings. So the way you lay these plants out, use them as a barrier to get to others, because animals are not going to trunch through a barrier of plants to get to one thing that's in the back. They're going to go for the easiest food first, if that makes sense. So let's talk about some smaller health nuts. I mentioned squirrels. I have heard some gardeners using this plant barrier technique to deter squirrels or even rabbits from foraging in their vegetable gardens. If anyone has had experience with this, please, feel free to share in the chat. But additionally, it appears that many squirrels are not a fan of spicy foods. So you can plant spicy pepper plants around some areas that you want to protect, or even sprinkle hot cayenne pepper in your soil or on your plants to deter them. Although this is an application you would have to repeat over the growing season, but it's an idea, right? So figure out what's attracting the squirrels. What are the squirrels or rabbits or deer eating? And figure out a way that they're not going to want to work towards getting it. Make it a little harder to get the good stuff is what I'm saying. So now I'm going to move on to some opportunistic eaters. And for wildlife, this includes omnivores, like our coyote and our raccoon here, among many others. But these are animals that have a wide diet and are bold enough to try new things, and they won't pass up a free meal. They love food. So, I mean, how many of you would fit this description? Are you a gastronomic explorer is what I'm labeling these animals. Now, since both raccoons and coyotes have this flexible diet, they adapt to live really well in all areas, from rural to suburban to urban. And they're curious. So they're not afraid to explore and take risks, but they are still very naturally wary of people. They're risk takers, but they are wary of humans. But this action of taking risks is beneficial because they will find new resources, new places to live, new foods to try. This curiosity can unfortunately also lead to nuisance behaviors. Raccoons won't turn away from an easy meal, and they are willing to try new things. And the more time they spend in closer proximity to humans without consequences can cause them to lose a natural fear of humans. If they don't see any reason to avoid us, then they start to become comfortable with us. And so both of these species learn and remember the locations that consistently provide an easy meal. They know the best options for those buffets. And by buffets, I mean unsecured garbage, gardens with easy to get to fruits and vegetables, or the busiest picnic and barbecue areas in our parks. So if we don't want to invite these visitors, understand this is going to take an effort and we have to change something in our behavior. So the easiest thing to do is just move the food away move it so they can't access it. Move your compost bin and garbage to a bin with a secure lid. Protect your plantings with other deterrents, whether that's a small fence or motion activated lights, and just reduce our food waste overall. So you can also be a deterrent yourself. When I talked about if there's no way for them if there's no consequences, they become more familiar with people. So what I mean by becoming a deterrent yourself is if you see a raccoon close by, or even a coyote, and if it even starts to approach you, make loud noises by yelling, clapping, make yourself look bigger by waving your arms, and continue this until the animal retreats. You may feel crazy doing it, but crazy can be a winning strategy to keep wildlife wary of humans. It does work. It does work if we all join in and do this. So now sometimes we want to be inviting and support wildlife directly by providing food, whether this is native pollinators by what we're planting, or attracting birds to our spaces with bird feeders. Birds are beneficial to our ecosystems, right? They eat insects, they help with pollinating plants, they even help disperse seeds from native plants. But I bring this up because I want everyone to be aware that a bird feeder, there's a lot more responsibility than just keeping the feeder full. So there are many online guides, and I encourage you to do a little bit of research and consider the best tips and guides for putting up a feeder. But these include things like, is the area safe for birds? Are you keeping the feeder clean? And are you keeping the area below it clean? Because there can be diseases that can be spread if the areas are not kept clean. And I just bring this up again, I want you to do your research to make sure that you're providing the best you're trying to provide a resource for this wildlife, so let's make it the best resource we can. And those online guides will have the best tips and answer questions about type of food, time of year, how do we make the spaces safe, and so on. But be careful though, because you are directly feeding one animal, but you are also possibly indirectly feeding another. Bird feeders attract more than just birds. They attract raccoons, squirrels, possibly feral cats who are interested in the birds, and even small rodents. So leaving any kind of food or water out will attract any number of species to crash at your food party. So just be aware of that. Be very purposeful in your efforts if you are looking to provide wildlife food in your own personal spaces, and understand the responsibilities you are giving yourself by doing that. And be aware that your human neighbors may complain about your wild party. So these are just reminders of all the things we've talked about regarding food. It's important to learn about the wildlife that you are seeing. If you want to limit your interactions with them, having an understanding about them will make that easier. So learn what their natural diet is and what might be attracting them. And we're going to have to be creative in deterring some of these animals or making access to the food resources they want a little more difficult. But these were just some of the methods that we discussed today. Looking to plant native, definitely securing garbage, reducing food waste, keeping that wildlife wary by keeping them fearful of humans, and being purposeful and responsible with bird feeders or other food sources. So that's food in a nutshell. And the other big attractant for wildlife in our outdoor spaces is shelter. So species that are comfortable living in close proximity with humans, like this handsome opossum, but it also includes raccoons, coyotes, squirrels, right? They are adapting to make use of the human-built environment for shelter. So they no longer just need trees or a dirt hill to make a burrow in. Anyone who has had squirrels in their attics or skunks living under a shed know this all too well. And during the early fall is when our unit really puts out that message that you should check areas that are going to be void of human activity during the winter to make sure that wildlife do not have access to it. So that's, making sure all windows and doors are shut, and repair holes and cracks in structure, clean up garden debris, and remove anything that can be seen as a potential winter shelter for wildlife if you don't want them overwintering in your areas. Now, more timely for this time of year, as the temperatures are warming, some species are going to be looking for temporary shelter to use during the breeding season. Now, if you don't want wildlife using your outdoor spaces as a nursery, we need to nip it before they start nesting or have young. So once eggs are laid or young are born, you really need to let the cycle run its course if you want to support the wildlife and allow the young to survive on their own. But, kind of do your research first, because some animals are protected. There are federal protections for some species like the red-tailed hawk that's pictured on the left. And for birds, you can discourage nest building indirectly before the eggs are laid. So for instance, in the hawk, once eggs are laid, you can't harass the hawk or interfere at all because that is against federal rules. But like if we use this photo, for example, with the hawk on the fire escape, you could just remove the sticks it was bringing to the fire escape early in the stages of nest construction. And then eventually it'll get deterred from using that area because somehow the sticks are magically disappearing. And the same with other animals. If you see any kind of animal bringing nesting material, so if you're seeing squirrels come through a crack up in your attic and you see all this, leaves and fluffy debris, start removing it and repair the holes so they don't have access to it. Now, ground nesters, such as ducks, even other small grassland type birds, they look for soft substrate and protected areas under shrubs or quiet areas that they can nest in. So this duck over the winter found an opened bag of soil kind of in a quiet area that was really only used for storage, and no one was going there over the winter into the spring. So the members of this area found it after the eggs were laid. Now, fortunately, everyone was okay with staying out of this area during incubation, and the family was able to incubate her eggs. The eggs hatched, and then they used a nearby pond and left just a few days after hatching. Now, smaller perching birds are very creative and find shelters in all types of structures. So if you don't want them nesting in a certain area, be diligent and try to deter them before they actually lay eggs. And you'll know they're making nests, right? So this is just showing a mourning dove carrying nesting material, so follow it, see where it's going. And if you don't want the nest in that area, deter it before it has a chance to lay eggs and make the space inhospitable to them. I will touch just very briefly about rodents. Now, rodents feel most comfortable running under cover and along walls. That's kind of what their mode is. Now, if you have a compost bin, that might be attracting rodents, especially if it's against a wall or a fence. So really important to keep the area around your compost bin clear to make it less desirable to travel to. So this picture is just an example of what was found underneath a cluttered, unorganized storage area. They felt protected underneath it, and they've created this nest of burrows. So once they clean the area, it's important to fill in the holes so that you're deterring them from having a burrow there. And if you need to amp up your pest management, I suggest using snap traps as much as possible. It is more labor intensive, but it can be safer for other wildlife versus some of the other options out there. So that's it in kind of in a basic nutshell. I mean, I just want to sum up. It's important that, again, we consider our outdoor spaces and reflect and evaluate where we are sharing space directly with wildlife. Right. So again, learn more about your local species, understand their motives, and that way we can change our actions and behavior to be able to coexist together. So how can you learn more about this wildlife? This is the fun part where I set you off on your own to do some research. So these are just some digital resources that are available to you. First, the mayor's office has a citywide multi-agency campaign called Wildlife NYC. And you may have seen these or similar ads around the city in the past, but it's an education campaign to increase public awareness about wildlife that are living amongst us, basically what we've been discussing today. And there are separate pages on the website devoted to specific species and information about their basic biology and coexistence tips. So the website address is there on the bottom right. But after you learn about these amazing species, you can learn about skunks, you can learn about beavers and piping plovers. Visit the Things to Do page. Here there are additional education resources for both formal and informal educators. Each month you will find volunteer opportunities that support wildlife and free public programming. Now the next big wildlife moment for New York City will be spring migration, and there are lots of groups, including New York City Parks, that will offer free walks for all skill levels to go looking for migrating birds. So try one. Bring a friend. It really is a great way to see our urban environment in a new perspective. And then the next time you are out working in your garden or walking in your neighborhood, and maybe you see some wildlife, raccoon, a possum, coyote, you can report it to our Healthy Wildlife Reporting a Sighting page. So we'd love to hear where these animals are being seen, and my team does use this data in various ways. So we would love to get reports of your sightings. And the Parks Department's website also is a great tool. This is kind of a close-up view of what we call our wildlife viewing calendar. And you can see what activity may be occurring around the city at any time of year. So I selected March, and in this image by the white and green balloons, you can see potential for mammal and bird activity during the month of March, just where we might be seeing different things. So I pulled up in Flushing Meadows Corona Park, we can be seeing red-tailed hawks potentially starting to do their courtship and making a nest, which we do have a nest every year that happens in that park, which is very exciting. But Parks also has other pages devoted to the best places to view wildlife, best places to go birding. So definitely check that out as a resource as well. And so I thank you for joining us today and learning more about my unit and how we can be a resource for you. Just remember, wildlife will be out there watching us and how we're behaving in the city. So it's important to learn about them, and we can kind of all safely coexist together. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Sunny, for that awesome presentation. I learned a lot, so I'm pretty sure a lot of people learned a lot about different resources to not attract animals that often come into the garden. So we have a few questions from the chat. And the first question is, how many deer, raccoons, various hawk species, and skunks are estimated to live within New York City?
It's a great question, and I will say that we do not specifically count numbers, but we kind of look for relative trends, and populations will naturally vary from year to year, but we do seem to have a healthy amount. If you're interested in the number of deer in Staten Island, we have been doing a large impact management study there, and you can actually go onto the Parks Department's website or the Wildlife NYC website, and you can look at a dashboard where we update those numbers every year. So if you want to learn more about Staten Island deer, I would suggest going to the Wildlife NYC website.
Okay. And I guess someone wants to know about non-native animals such as dogs, cats, and rats. Are they counted by New York City wildlife?
Right. So we do not count because I don't know if we'd be able to we're a very small team, and I don't know if we could get an accurate number of counting, especially since, as I've mentioned, they don't just live in parks. They live in many, many areas of the city. But we do make sure that domestic animals are not left in parks. Obviously, it's not a safe area for them, so we try to discourage anyone from abandoning pets in the parks, and we try to discourage any sort of feral cats in the area, but we don't keep a count of everything.
Okay, awesome. Just trying to read through this. I think you answered most of the questions that was in the chat.
Okay.
So if anybody have any other questions, we have about 2 more minutes. Sunny will be very happy to answer your questions if you have any.
And I can also use this, if anyone has questions and want to post to the Slack group chat, we can look at doing that as well.
Yeah, so I have another question. There are many non-native birds in New York City, sparrows, pigeons being the most familiar to people, but does wildlife get involved dealing with tracking the many tropical birds in the city? Especially like, I know like there's birds around Central Park.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions in there. So speaking of birds, I have a bird right here. This is one of the tropical species that are now wild, but mine was a pet, so he decided to make an appearance. How appropriately at that timing. Sparrows and pigeons are correct. So traditionally, these species were not found in North America, but they've been here for over 200 years. So there's a big debate whether you want to consider them native or not native at this point. But again, we don't keep accurate counts of them, but we do keep an eye on the populations, and we monitor them for wildlife diseases and that sort of thing. We don't keep an accurate count of them. As for the tropical birds, so again, there are populations of these quakers or monk parakeets that are not a native bird in North America. And within the last 50 years, they found ways to survive and adapt. So we have populations of these monk parakeets around Greenwood Cemetery, Howard Beach. I've heard sightings in along Riverside Park on the Upper West Side. So they are adapting to live here on their own. And so we're not my unit doesn't go into specifically manage it, but it's something we just kind of make observations on. As for some of the other rare species, like we've been having the snowy owl, I don't know if that's what maybe this question was representing, or the mandarin duck that was here a year ago. Again, those are great, and we love to keep track of those, and we'll make a little note for historical references.
Yes, thank you, Sunny.